So this week we start Chumash Devorim, Mishnah Torah. And in the beginning of the Parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu teaches some of the fundamentals of Din, Tzedek, Mishpat. And the sugya we will be discussing today is one of the most fundamental Yesodis in Torah Shebaal Peh. Ein ledayin ela masha einav royos. That's an expression we find 3 times in Shas, Sanhedrin, Nida, Bava Basra. That's not the proper order, but that will be the order of today's Shiur. We will define each of these 3 sugyas. So what do Chazal mean? Ein ledayin ela masha einav royos. Let's start with the weekly parsha. So Moshe Rabbeinu tells the people, I put together a hierarchy of dayanim. Sorei alafim, sorei meos, sorei chamishim, v'sorei asoreis. Va'atzave es shofteichem be'esahu leimor. Shemoa ben achechem, ushfatetem tzedek ben ish ubein re'ehu. Or Chaim HaKodesh says, Shemoa is a loshan, analyze, try to understand. Shemoa ben achechem. Ushfatetem tzedek ben ish ubein achev. Or Chaim says, sometimes a judge, a shofet, a dayan, just listens to what the parties have to say and then decides who's right. But sometimes the dayan has to listen carefully what the party said and what they did not say. Not only what they said, but how they said. And sometimes the conclusion is very different than what any of the parties really argued. And in that case, the dayan has to paskin lefi tzedek and not lefi hamishpat, because justice and law are not always the same, and not always do they coincide. Shemoa bein achechem means listen to what happens bein achechem, between the parties. Ushfadetem tzedek. And tzedek is not necessarily mishpat. And the Rechaim quotes the Lashon of Chazal, Ein ledayin ela masha einav royos. And that is a new interpretation. You need to judge according to what you see, subjectively, not what the parties argued, what you analyze and you understand and you conclude. And he quotes, Ein ledayin ela masha einav royos. So I'm putting the Rechaim aside for a few minutes, and I want to explain the 3 sugyas in Shas. And Hedin Daf Vav Amid Beis, Chazal teach us what an awesome responsibility it is to be a dayan. Gehenim psuchol amitachtov, cherev tluyama al rosho. Shemi yoimer mali veletzar hazeh. It's such an awesome responsibility. So a Talmud Chacham will say, why get into it? Why look for tzaras? Talmud Loimar. Imochem b'dvar mishpat. That's a posuk in Divrei Hayomim. En ledayin ela masha einav royos. Rashi on the spot says, Im adayin egia lahiroa. You fit the job. You're a Talmud Chacham. You have smicha from your Rebbeim, and you do your best. You have nothing to be afraid of. V'lo ne'enash, you will not be punished. We could all make mistakes. It's part of the human condition and human nature. If you do your best, and you're ma'ayin in halacha, quoting Rashi, Lidoin v'yeschaven lahoitziyoi letzidkoi v'la'amitoi shuv lo ye'anesh. V'hu she'amru chachomim ein ledayin ela masha einav royos. Sugya number 2 is in Nida Daf Chaf Amid Beis, dealing with Hilchos Nida. So when a dayan sees a matter, he doesn't need to say, maybe it looked different yesterday and maybe it'll look different tomorrow. Ein ledayin ela masha einav royos. You judge according to what you see. So the Gemara says you don't need to be choishish, maybe it was different tomorrow. The Taz and the Shach Beresh Kuf Peches disagree with the Bach, and they say you don't have to think maybe it'll look different tomorrow. Ein ledayin elo masha ein avroyis, in real time. Sugya number 3, Bava Basa, Kuf Lamed Amid Beis, going on Kuf Lamed Aleph Amid Aleph. Rava, the great Amoida, tells us Talmidim, Rav Papa and Ravuna Breida Rav Yehoshua. If you see my psak, and I will no longer be with you, it'll be after my demise, and you'll have a kasha on my psak. Mikra lo tikre'inei, ve'migmar lo tigmeru minei. Don't tear it to shreds and throw it away. I want you to assume, if you would have the opportunity to ask me, I would explain myself and you would see that I'm right. But on the other hand, ein ledayin ela masha ein avroyis. So you can't ignore your own opinion and your own feeling. So you cannot paskin in accordance to what I paskined. You need to follow your own judgment. Ein ledayin ela masha ein avroyis. So let's briefly discuss these 3 concepts and broaden them somewhat. Going back to Sanhedrin, you do your best. You might be mistaken. It's inevitable. You did your best, b'toim lev, with good faith, lo ya'onesh. Interesting that Ramban and Ran say the same regarding doctors. Many times I pointed out that doctors and Rabbonim have many things in common. Recently, a young American boy asked me, is it true that I paskin that if you're not going to be a Rosh Hashiva, you should be a doctor? Well, no, that's not a psak. Nobody could give it as a psak. But I did say, second best profession. If you're not going to be a marbitz, to be a doctor. You're doing chesed all day and all night. So the Ramban in Torah Sa'odem Shara Meichush Inyan Asakona and the Chidush Aran Sanhedrin Peidalad Umed Beis both quote the Gemara and Bava Kama Daf Pei Hey. Both Omed Aleph and Omed Beis Tona de Bere Bishmol. V'rapo yarapa mekansha nitnu reshus leroifel arapos, writes the Ramban, almost the same language as the Gemara Sanhedrin Vav Omed Beis. Shema yoimer mali v'letzora hazois. Maybe I'll administer medicine, I'll do an operation, and the patient will die. Would I be considered a murderer, a shoifech damim? So why get into it? Why not be a businessman? Why not be a peddler? A shopkeeper? Why be a doctor? I might kill a person. And how will I atone for such a great Avera? Talmud loy mevarape yorape. So the Ramban and the Ran draw a comparison like a dayan. You did your best. You studied. You have your degree. And you tried your best. Yes, you might bring about the demise of a person. Lo ya'onesh, you have nothing to be afraid of. What is the common denominator? What is the tzad shova? How did the Shonim learn this principle from the Yonim? We do not find it in Chazal regarding doctors. It's the Ramban and the Ran. And the two are following in their footsteps, Yordei Shin Lamed Vav. But the Ramban and the Ran, unlike the two, quote the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Amid Beis that deals with the Yonim. I think doctors and Rabbonim have 2 things in common, 2 fundamentals. Number 1, it's a service that we desperately need, and there could be no Yiddishkeit and no decent society without spiritual leaders and doctors, especially in Yahadus. Without the Yonim, Ishes re'eyu chayim balo v'nimtzehu olam chorev. Without Rabbonim, lo yenachtu bas l'Avraham Avinu, who will give us psak, who will give us guidance. So there can be no Klal Yisrael without Rabbonim and Moira Hoirah. There could be no decent society without doctors who will treat the ill, who will care for the sick. How would we memekayim the posek v'rapo yarapa mekanchin norishus l'roifel arapos? The second thing they have in common is doubt. We are always riddled with doubt. Milano Godel Maharamban. And the Ramban in his introduction to Sefer HaMalchamis apologizes and he says, I know sometimes my arguments aren't mukhrach. One could doubt my judgment. One could argue against my ruling. That's the nature of Torah. We do our best, ledamis milsa la milsa, but not always could we convince. People might have different opinions. From the first Mishnah in Shas till the last Mishnah in Shas, it's all about argumentation and all the sugyas and all the rishonim and all the achonim. So the Ramban says it's unlike mathematics or astronomy. It's not an absolute science. That's the lashon of the Ramban I'm quoting. So yes, as Poskei Halacha, sometimes we are in doubt. There's another Ramban which is amazing. Sefer Aschus Yavom Estesam Adalaf Medape Arif. So the Ramban was a big chassid of the Rif, and he wrote for him to reject all the kashas of the Ravid and the Baramor, the Razor and the Rif. And to the Ramban, the Rif is always right, except once. Yavam Estesam Adalaf. After a lengthy discussion, the Ramban lifts his hands and as if surrenders. And he says, Ulai ein divrei ba'al halochis bezen nechonim, ki hashleimos eino elo, loi levado yisborach v'yishtabach v'yisgadel shmoy HaGadol. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always right. And maybe the Alfasi, the great Rabbeinu Yitzchak the Rif, maybe here he's not right. The same as in medicine. Doctors use their best judgment based on experience, based on medical accumulative knowledge. Sometimes they might make mistakes, and doctors sometimes are riddled with doubt. So they're the 2 points which are common by Rabbonim on one hand and Lahavdil doctors on the other. And that is why the great Ramban, the Talmidei Talmidov, say, just like the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, Ein ledayin ela ma she'ein evroyes, and you did your best. You have nothing to be afraid of. The same applies to doctors. Yes. You might make mistakes. And when a doctor makes a mistake, people pay a terrible price. But he did his best. Ve'ein atu ben chorin lehibot lehemena, because this is a service to people that we cannot live without. So this is a yesod regarding both Rabbonim and doctors, as I explained. So on one hand, Chazal say, you did your best, you have nothing to be afraid of, but let's not forget the Mishnah Novos, Perik Dalad Mishnah Yud Gimel Havazor B'Talmud, Kishigas Talmud Oile Zodoin. Be careful with your learning, because when a Rav and a Posek is a shoygig, he's amazed. You should have learned better. So how do these two divrei Chazal go together? No contradiction. Yes. You need to take your learning seriously. Chas v'sholem. If you don't, you bear an awesome responsibility. But if you did your best, you learned Yom and V'laylo, Higia Lahiro, Husmach al Yedei Rabboisav, then you have nothing to be afraid of. So the Oira Chaim gives an additional amkus to Ein Ledayin Ela Ma She'ein Evroyes, and the Oira Chaim explains sometimes the Dayan needs to take responsibility on himself and not just follow the word of the law, but the spirit of the law, tzedek, and not only mishpat. It's not only what they say, but how they say, and what fashion they say, and what they prefer not to tell the Beis Din. And that sometimes will bring you to your conclusion. I think the Rechaim has somewhat of a source in the Rambam, Perek Chov Dalad Melchas Sanhedrin, and the Rambam is quoted in Choshe Mishpat Siman Tes Vav, and the Rambam writes that a Dayan has the authority to judge according to his own personal, subjective, intuitive judgment, even though he has no proof, no evidence, and no clear testimony. That's a big chiddush of the Rambam. And the Achronim deal, what is the source of this Rambam? We won't go into it. We're not learning Hilchos Dayanim today, but that's what the Rambam says. And then the Rambam says, however, this was only B'doros HaRishonim. In our generations, we no longer rely on umdana, on subjective feelings and personal conviction, only testimony, only proof. Would we say the same in medicine? In Torah we know about Yeridas Hadoiras. That's the very essence of halacha. The Ameroim looked for sources in the Mishnah and the Braisa. The Gaonim looked for sources in the Gemara. The Achronim looked for sources in Rishonim. Im Rishonim kam halacha monu kibnei Yodam. Im Rishonim kibnei Yodam onu kechamorim. V'lo kechamorim shel Pinchas ben Yor say Chazal. So in Torah we assume that the Rishonim were giants and we are little Lilliputans. The famous mashal, which I quote from time to time. The world quotes Sir Isaac Newton when he was asked, how do you dare to disagree with Archimedes? He was a giant. And Newton said, he was a giant and I'm a midget. But I'm a midget that stood on the shoulder of giants, and therefore I see farther than they have seen. 500 years before Isaac Newton, we find this moshel in Piskei Harid, Chuvas Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Rishon, and many other Rishonim. Nanas she'omed al tzavarei anakim. That is the loshem of the Taisus Rid. So, we assume, regarding Torah, we are midgets. They were giants. But in any other field of science and knowledge, we know far more than our predecessors, than what previous generations knew. But an interesting Ramah, Even Ezer Kuf Mem Hey Sif Tes, Shulchan Aruch deals with a get shchiv mera. So the original formula of a get shchiv mera, im meisi mechoili zeh yehi get. So if he doesn't die from this sickness, then he could take his wife back, and the get is annulled. It is invalidated. Shulchan Aruch says one should not write the meisi mechoili zeh, because there might be people that will bring a medical document and a doctor's opinion that he did not die from this choili, and then get bottle of a b'nei mamzerim. So when I get shchimra, one should write im meisi ad your employee, not mechoili zeh. And the Ramah says, anyway, doctors in our time no longer have the power and the knowledge to determine why the person died. So the Ramah seems to indicate that doctors once were more knowledgeable than they are today. Doesn't that go against conventional wisdom? In reality, we have far more information than we ever had, than our predecessors did. So yes, we know far more than they knew, but their genius surpassed ours by miles and miles. We have far more information, far more data than they ever had. But the great minds of yore, the great philosophers and the great musicians and the great composers are no longer with us. So maybe in other fields of knowledge as well, as in Torah lahavdil, im rishonim kimaloch amonu kibnei Yodam, that seems to be clear in the Ramon Even Ezer Kuf Mem Hey, as I quoted regarding the din of get shchiv mera. So once again, ein ledayan ela masha ein of royers. Two principles. Number one, if you did your best, einoi nenash. That's all HaKadosh Baruch Hu can expect from a human being. Shkiyas miyaven. Number two, you need to apply your conviction and your judgment, and sometimes that should be the basis of your ruling. Shulchan Aruch and Rambam say, no longer. Nidad Avchaf. A dayan needs to judge in accordance to what he sees, and he doesn't need to be choishish. Maybe the model was different yesterday, maybe it's going to be different tomorrow. Does that have anything to do with another concept, Lo nitnu Torah l'malachei hashores? No. The sugya of loy nitna Torah malacha shoreis I discussed at great length. Shalosh Tuvas Menchasos Chelik Aleph Simen Mem Aleph and Chelik Beis, I think Simen Nun Gimel maybe. So loy nitna Torah malacha shoreis means you judge according to what the senses that Kodesh Baruch Hu gave you. So if there might be insects which are microscopic, that is not an Isur Toloim. You don't need to go beyond what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you, the tools that are your toolbox that was supplied to you by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Lo nitne Torah l'malach ha'shos, we're human beings. But this is a different concept. Why not wait till tomorrow? Why not be choshish for yesterday? Gillian Marsho Yoredei Nun Hey understands, Lo machzikinan isura. I think a few weeks ago I gave a shiur on this concept. It's a very broad-based and profound yesod. I made it clear then in that shiur that if it's shchicha, we need to be choshish, v'machzikinan isura. So the Median, Nidad Avchov says, Shinui maris lo matsui. So maybe that's the reason, Ein ledayin ela mashein avrois. But I think it's a more fundamental principle in halacha. The Ritva writes in Masechet Nuda, if you want to be 100% sure, then the posek needs to stand there. You know, when the woman has a period, and now that's impossible. Therefore, this is yesod in halacha. You always judge according to what you see right here and now. Sugya number 2. Sugya number 3. Rava tells us great Talmidim, follow your judgment. Yes, you're my Talmidim, but you cannot rely on my psak if you disagree. And it seems to you that I'm wrong. Probably I'm right, Rava tells us Talmidim, but nevertheless, you rely on your judgment. Ki ein ledayan ela masha ein avroyas. How far do we take this? So would we say a Rav that disagrees with the Shach or the Magen Avraham or the Shulchan Aruch relies on his judgment? Of course not. There are fundamental rules. Simachov ein choshe mishpat Shach sivkot nechof alef and Nesivas chidushim sivkot nechof. Both make it very clear. The sugya of Bava Basra is an exception. As a rule, we accept the ruling of previous generations of Gedolei Yisrael with tremendous humbleness and humility. Offer anu tachas kabes regleihem, and we don't question what they ruled. That applies to the great giants of previous generations. We accept their ruling, whether we like it or not, whether we understand it or not. Unless there are machlokes between the Gedolim. Chasam Sofer, Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, Chelek Vav Simen Nun. His interpretation of the Gemara in Bava Basra is, if you're cholik b'svora, batlu da'ateinu, anan ke'etzba b'kira b'svora. Rav tells us, Talmidim, only if you have a percha from a Mishnah or a Braisa that is befurish against my ruling, then don't accept my ruling. But that seems to go against the Rashbam. The Rashbam in Bava Basra Kuf Lamed Aleph explains the Chiddush of Rava is, in Svara we also say Ein ledayan elo masha ein avroyos. So the Rashbam does specify Svara. According to the Chasam Sofer says, if we have a psak from a gadol and he didn't explain what is psak based on, we will always be makabelis psak. If he did explain and we have a percha, then we have the right to disagree. So I just want to quote two fascinating sources, the Rashba and the Rosh. Seem to be two different approaches and attitudes. So the Rashba was asked, Chelik Beis Meshin Chov Beis, regarding the Gemara on Bava Basra. So Rava tells us, Talmidim, don't rely on me, rely on your own personal judgment. So aren't we supposed to rely on the Torah and the Psukim of our predecessors of the giants of yore? The Rashba says, of course, yes. And the Rashba quotes many sources in the Gemara. Achroine Amaroim botlu datam lerishoine Amaroim. Amaroim never disagreed with Tanoim. Later Tanoim accepted the ruling of earlier Tanoim. That's fundamental in the entire Shas. So the Rashba's understanding of the Gemara Bava Basra is mitzamtzim, he limits it tremendously. And the Rashba is the one that says, you cannot be cholek and svara, only a percha. But once again, it goes against the Rashbam. So my feeling is, Rava talks to his Talmidim, almost the same generation. He was the Rebbe, they were the Talmidim, but same generation. In that case, the Talmud should apply his own judgment. It's not the same when we deal with the Torah of the giants of yore, especially Amudei HaHalocha L'Kol Beis Yisrael. It's not only we cannot dispute Rishonim, we cannot disagree with the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. We must rely on the Noid B'Yehuda and Chasam Sofer and the giants of previous generations. So yes, if you have sources of other poskim against those poskim, that is your responsibility to decide what the halacha will be. So there were some Gedolim that based their psukim on the Rishonim alone. Rav Moshe is a very good example, the Igros Moshe. The Igros Moshe doesn't deal a lot with Achronim, but he was really a giant. And sometimes he bases his psukim on the Gemara and the Rishonim. Very few poskim could do that. Very few poskim had the places, the broad shoulders to do that. Very few poskim had the greatness of Rav Moshe to do that. So Rav Moshe, in the introduction to Chelek Aleph Igros Moshe, makes his hashkafa very clear. And he quotes the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Vav Amud Beis, Ein ladayin ela ma she'ein avroyos. But Rav Moshe was unique. I'm a Talmud of the great Kloisim HaGareva, the Divrei Yatzav, and he learned a lot of Achronim. And I remember once he got a sefer on the mail, and he looked into the sefer, and usually when he got a sefer, he responded, and he wrote the Mechaber a letter dealing with his Divrei Torah. So he saw in this sefer that the Mechaber writes, I don't bring Achronim, I don't learn Achronim, and he became so angry, he packed up the sefer and he wrote a letter, I didn't know that you're a Rishon. You don't learn Achronim, so why do you expect me to learn your sefer? Obviously you're an Achron, and he sent the sefer back in the mail. Very typical of the Kloisim HaGareva. He was an enical of the Divrei Chaim, and he had this sharfkeit. So that's a story about the Divrei Yatzav. He didn't like the fact that the Mechaber brags that he doesn't look on Achronim, so he just packed the sefer and wrote a short letter. Neither do I, so why do you expect me to learn your sefer? And he sent it back. So the Mesoires HaHalacha is, yes, we start with Chazal, with the Gemaras, we go through the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Poskim, and we definitely don't ignore what the Gedolim of previous generations had to say, including the great Poskim of our generation. That is the central tradition of halacha that we follow. So Tshuvas Rashba says we don't dare to be choylekan Gedolim of previous generations. But then we have Tshuvas Rosh. Klal Nun Hey Simentes. And the Rosh was asked a similar shaila. And the response of the Rosh is very different. And he writes, Milan Ugodol, the great Bali Atosis. Rabbeinu Tam and Veri. They were Eineklich of Rashi. They were Talmidim of Rashi. And in almost every daf and shas, they disagree with Rashi. Kach darka shel Torah. Every generation applies his own kishun, his own talent, his own mind, his own yagir Torah, and he has the right to disagree with the previous generation. There definitely is a difference in style, in tone between the Rosh and the Rashba. What I call this a machloikis, not necessarily. The Rosh definitely agrees with every line in Tshuvas Rashba. Of course, Ameroim were Mavatal Datom Litanoim. And later Ameroim accepted the ruling of the previous Ameroim. And the Rosh would definitely agree that Riya Rabbeinu Tam could be choilek on Rashi, but they can't be choilek on Ravina v'Ravashi. So it depends. Yes, Ravi tells his Talmidim, don't rely on me, apply your judgment. Riya and Rabbeinu Tam were giants. They were Talmidim of Rashi. And they took the liberty to be choilek on Rashi with tremendous ismatlas and hachnoah and another kachi darka shel Torah. But you cannot go back many generations and disagree with the greatest poskim. No, that is no longer legitimate. One more fascinating point which I want to make: a difference between the Mechaber and the Mo, leorka ulerochbo shel Shulchan Aruch. And this is an observation I observed many, many years ago. And there are so many sources, but I will just bring 10 sources. I think 10 is enough. 10 is a special number. 10 is Kedusha. Kol ve'asor shchin tishari. Fascinating Rashi. Nun beis medalaf Masechet Chilin. Rashi brings the halachas gedolos regarding the bedika of treifes. Halachas gedolos says we're not boki. We're not boki and bedikas of treifes. So we only rely on shnei mos chodesh. Did the animal live? Then it's not treifa. And Rashi says, Ein ledayin elo masha ein of royes, quoting the Gemara in Nida and in Sanhedrin. And we are boki. We should be boki. L'cha'ira, Rashi argues, there's no such a thing. The generation says we're no longer boki. You got to be boki. Learn. Based on the Messiah, on the tradition that was handed down to us by the previous Gedolim. We are boki, says Rashi. But Rashi quotes the Gemara in Sanhedrin of Zion. Rav Ashi, when they had a question, they brought together all the Rabbanim, all the Sheikhtim, and discussed the question with others. Don't be arrogant to rely on yourself. Always seek the opinion of others. And if you do, you are boki. We are boki, and we could rely on our Bekiyas and Treifes. That's Rashi. Comes along the Or Zerua, Sechet Chulin, Tov Tet Zayin. He says, even Rashi spoke about his generation. They were giants. Years have transpired. We are no longer boki. And the Ramo quotes the Or Zerua, and that's his psak, twice in Yoredeya. Nun Zayin Yud Ches, Nun Ches, Sivav. And now I want to bring 10 different sources in which the Mechaber says, yes, we're boki, and the Ramo says, no, we're not boki. I don't know whether this is fundamental in Darkei Apsak between Sfardim and Ashkenazim. Maybe it's personal. The Ramo was a tremendous onav, and it's very obvious in his tshuvas. Starting off with Hilchos Shabbos. Shin Yud Zayin Sif Aleph. According to the Mechaber, Kosher b'Shabbos is only diurais if it's a kesher uman and kesher shel kayama. So if it's not a kesher uman, we could be mekel. Then Amos says we're not boki b'kesher uman. We don't know. Shin Lamed Sif Hey. The Mechaber deals with a tragic case of a woman that passed away, died during childbirth. So he cut open the belly of the mother to save the child. And the Ramo says we're not boki b'misa su'eim. We cannot determine exactly when is the exact time of death. We're not boki, writes the Ramo in Shin Lamed. Going over to Yoredeya, Dinei Shchita, Shiur, Drasa, Chaloda, 3 seifim in Shulchan Aruch, Chav Gimel, Simach Chav Gimel, and Siv Daled. Chav Gimel Sivav, Chav Daled Sivav, Sif Yud. The Mechaber says how we need to be boidik, and the Ramon, all 3 seifim, says we're not boki b'bedika. And that's the way the Biragra explains the Ramo in those 3 halachas. In Bedikas Hasakin Shel Shchita the Chalef, Yud Ches Vav, the Mechaber says in a certain case how we're boidik, and the Ramo says we're not boki. Bedikas Aveshet, the Mechaber is boki, and the Ramo says no. Lamed Gimel Sivav, very same siman. Lamed Gimel Ches, Sofik Drusa, The Mechaber says how we're boidik, and the Ramos says we're not boki. Etzem akulis shenishbaro, nun hey sif yud. Mechaber says you're boidik, and the Ramos says we're not boki. Number 10. Te'imas kfeila. Medina de Gemara and Medina de Shulchan Aruch. If Isur is cooked together with Heter, the majority of the dish is Heter. Miyat Isur. We ask a chef to taste and tell us, is the Isur, do you feel the taste of the Isur? The Ramo says, Simen Tzadik Beis Yifarav Tzadik Ches Yifarav, twice in the Yoredeya. We do not rely on Te'imas Kfeila. The Ramo doesn't say why. In Shulchan Aruch he doesn't say, but he does say in Toras Chatos. And in Toras Chatos the Ramo says we're not boki b'ta'am. So 10 sources, which the Mechaber says how we do a bedika, and the Ramo says no, we're not boki, and there are many others. Going all the way back to Rashi and Alochas Gedolos. Alochas Gedolos says we're not boki b'treifis, and Rashi says we are. And Rashi quotes the Gemara, Ein ladayin ela masha ein avroyes, meaning we apply our judgment in every generation. They were greater than we are. They were wiser than we are. They were more booky than we are. But that's our chiyuv. That's our obligation in every generation. Ein ladayin ela masha ein avroyes. But as I quoted from the Arzerua and the Ramola, Orka ula rochbo shel Shulchan Aruch, at some stage, Gedolim said, we no longer have the insight, the wisdom, the know-how, the Chachmas HaTorah, to deal with certain areas in Halach. So today we discuss one of the most fundamental yesodis and concepts in Torah Shebal Peh, Ein ledayin ela masha ein avroyes. Many people think it's just a melitza ba'alma. But as we explained today, it is fundamentally yesodis in halacha.